Good morning, everybody. So today's Laser Pro webinar, we're talking about labour rates. So as a trade business, you sell two things, materials and labour. So it is really important that the labour rates that we have in your Laser Pro system are as accurate as possible and are reflecting the, actual costs of the business, as well as the operating expenses, technician costs. Have we factored all of this into account when we're looking at labour rate costs and sell? So the first thing that we want to look at in this regard is the overhead cost calculator. So I've got one on my other screen, so I'll share this with you. Now, this resource is available on the SimPro Help Guide, or I would think, and Ron, you can correct me if I'm wrong, and that it should probably be available on your intranet somewhere as well for ease of reference. Hopefully everyone can see that okay. So this is the SimPro overhead and employment calculator. So the first tab that we want to look at is the employee data entry tab. So this is the only tab, or main tab, I should say, that you need to put in information for. So all of these columns from A to P is the data entry columns, and then the blue columns from Q onwards, these are all formulated fields, and it will do the calculations for you based on the numbers that you input in these first columns. So in here, we want to put in all of our chargeable technicians. So I would only include field staff in this overhead calculator. Please don't put in any office-based staff or people that are solely an overhead to the business, because otherwise we're going to double dip, because we're going to put in an overhead cost in another field later, and we don't want to account for them twice, because then that's going to inflate our figures. So we've got here whether we're including them in the overhead recovery, yes or no. We can do it based on 52 weeks in a year. You can do less time periods. So say you wanted to do it for a quarter, you can, but obviously just make sure that all your figures are in line with a quarter instead of a year, if that's the case. When we're talking about some of these other fields like paid training days, annual leave, etc., you're going to have to adjust the figures if you did want to do it for a smaller period. So it is possible, but just keep that in mind. So working days for the week 5, working hours for the day 8, estimated average non-billable hours per day. So this is half an hour, but the likelihood of a technician being chargeable on a job 7.5 hours a day is, depending on what type of work you do, potentially slim by the time they're driving between jobs, and if we're not charging for that time. So maybe somewhere around an hour, maybe 2. It's up to you as a business to make that decision on what numbers, kind of that average and most applicable to you. But yes, somewhere between half an hour, 2 hours. Please make your decision accordingly. But just keep in mind that whatever figure you do put in there will affect your calculations, because obviously then there's less chargeable time to recoup the overhead costs. The next one is the employee pay rate per hour. So very important what the field workers actually get paid per hour. So if someone's getting a pay rise throughout the year, please come in here and update this, because it will have a flow-on effect to some of the later calculations in this spreadsheet. So even if they go up by, say, I don't know, $2 an hour, that's still going to have an effect in the long run. So it's still worth coming in and updating this. Their super rate, payroll tax, work cover, if applicable, please fill them in. Other employment costs per period. So at the moment, there's nothing in my example one, but some things that you could put in here if we're giving them some kind of like tool allowance, or giving them allowance because they're using, say, their personal phone, anything like that that we're paying them for, that we want to factor in. Public holidays for the period, paid training days, so especially if it's, say, an apprentice, making sure that we're capturing in here what days they might be at training. Annual leave days per period, 20, and planned unpaid leave days per period. Because it's planned unpaid, if we know about it in advance, say a technician's taking, an extended leave for a holiday or something, and we can factor that in because we know about it in advance, we can put that in here. And sick leave days per period as well. So once we've factored in all of this information, it's going to do all these calculations on the right-hand side. You can look at them, but they're not the, I guess, numbers that we're interested in for a laser process. So it's still worthwhile to have a look at this for the potential billable hours per period versus non-billable salary, etc. But what we really want to look at is if I come to my overhead and employment cost summary tab now to the right, this is the Laser Pro information that we're after. So once you come in here, based on the figures that we've put on the previous tab, it's going to calculate our pay rate per hour, employment cost per hour, and overhead per hour. Now, the total overhead per period figure up here in this dark blue, you do need to fill this in yourself. So generally, you would get this figure from 0. So get your P&L for the period and take out any, we would take out the technician's wages because, again, we don't want to factor it in twice and inflate any figures. So what I would keep in this figure is any operating expenses, rent, admin wages, vehicle costs, etc. I would keep all of that in this figure, but just make sure that we've taken out any technician-related wages. So once we've put this figure in at the top here, it's going to calculate our total overhead per hour based on the amount of billable hours from this first tab. So that's why even if you say had 0.5, if I change this to 1 across the board, let's drag this down. That's now changed my overhead per hour to a different rate because we now have a different total billable hours across the period to recoup the same rate. So just be really mindful because as you add a technician, lose a technician, someone gets a pay rise, say your admin wages go up, all of those things have pretty big impacts to these figures. So as people come and go in the business, especially field staff, please update this because losing someone or gaining someone has about, well, on average, somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 billable hours impact to these figures. So once we've got our pay rate per hour, employment cost per hour, and overhead per hour, these figures can go into their employee cards, which is really important. So in their employee cards, there's the rates tab, and we can put that in there, and that's where the actual costs come from. Now, the reason that I say this is because our labor rates and our employee cards are actually quite intertwined, is probably the best word to describe it. As much as they have different purposes, if we don't align them, then our profit and loss for labor in a job is going to be very skewed. So if we've put in all 3 of these figures in an employee card from an actual perspective, and when we schedule them to a job, but we haven't factored in all 3 of these costs in a labor rate when we have quoted the job in the first place, well, we're not comparing apples with apples anymore. So we do need to take these into account. So on this very right-hand side, column J, we've got the total cost per hour, and it's added those 3 blue column figures together. So the highest possible cost to have someone in the field is $109.39. Oh, sorry, I take that back. There's an 111. So if we've got one of our labor rate costs as, say, $90 an hour, well, that might be the average, but if we're sending Charlie to site, we're actually losing nearly $20 an hour, or a bit over $20 an hour. So what I generally recommend is you can take the average. So if I hover over this, it's average 97.34. But what I would probably recommend instead is put in the cost in your labor rate as the highest paid technician. And that way, if we end up sending someone that gets paid slightly less, so say we send Bill instead of Charlie, well, then that's just extra margin that we're going to get on the job. But at least if we've factored in the worst case scenario, well, we're just going to get a little bit back. So these figures are very important. So now that we've done the calculations and we've got some figures to work with, I'm just going to take this figure with me. And now we're going to jump into Laser Pro. Making sure you can still see the screen sharing. So once we come into Laser Pro, I'll just make that a little bit bigger for you. If we come into our system setup, and then into our labor and labor rates, we've got in here all of our existing labor rates, and they've got their cost and sell. Now, based on what we were just looking at, this advanced technician as an example, we're selling it as $120 an hour, and the cost rate is 90. But as we just saw, if I put Charlie on that job, we know that we're going to be losing money sending Charlie as a result. Maybe some of the other technicians, it might kind of balance itself out. But in this case, what I want to do is I want to update my advanced technician cost rate to be more in line with Charlie, so that way we can get a better idea of our costs. So if I click into this, and if I update my cost rate, it has now changed my sell rate as a result, because it's kept the markup, whatever it was before. I'm going to change that. It goes both ways. So you could either update the cost and then it will do the markup and update the sell rate, or if you update the sell rate, it could potentially go back the other way. But I think it was 120 off the top of my head. Now, there's a few buttons down below here where under the options, and this trips a lot of members up. I have many conversations about this in Australia, especially. So I've got cost rate including overhead. I'll touch on that in a minute, just because I have a more in-depth explanation on that. Add to all customers. So do we want to add this labor rate to every single customer that's in the system? In this case, yes. Do we want it to be our default labor rate? We can only have one default, so there was another default in the system at the moment, so I'm not going to turn that on. But did we want to say override it and have a new default? But the button that trips people up the most is this bottom one, update changes to all customers with the current rate or all customers. So the difference between these, and some people just forget to do this. So if I update this now, 111, I'm just going to hit save and not toggle any of that. So if you come in here, you've done your calculator, you update the rate and you hit save and you think, great, I've updated it. The system's now got the new rate. Unfortunately, it doesn't. Your existing customer cards that are already in the system have not been updated to $111.34 as a result. And the reason for that is because of that bottom toggle. So if I come back into it now, and it says update changes to all customers with current rate, if I just toggle it on and hit save again, it's still not going to update them. And I'll explain why. It's because it's looking for customers with the current rate to then apply the changes to. So the existing customer cards are still on 90 from when we saved it the first time. So because it's on 90, but when we're saving it, it's looking for 111, it's not going to update them. So what you generally need to do in that scenario is change it back to what it was originally. So say 90 and 120. Hit save. And then come back in and make your changes again to 111. Yep, 111 and 120. And then go toggle update changes to all customers with the current rate. So that way it's looking for 90, but it's now updating to 111. So it does trip a lot of people up because you do kind of have to undo and redo the steps that you've just taken. So it can be a bit confusing, but if you ever want to check that the changes have definitely applied, you can do that. So if I just save on that now, you can do that by going into a customer card. So if I come into a customer card and come into the rates tab and the labor sub tab, if you ever want to check whether the changes that you've made have applied based on those few settings and scenario I just spoke about, if you come in here, you can see the advanced technician now does reflect the $111 as a result. So if that still said 90, I know that I've done something wrong, and maybe I haven't toggled it the first time, and in which case we'd have to go back and undo it, put it back to 90, save it, and then add the 111 again, and then toggle it back on. Hopefully that makes sense. Does anyone have any questions about that toggle? The update changes to customers with their current rate. Perfect. So if I come back to my labor rates in system setup, so now that we've updated that, that's really positive. But now I want to talk about this default overhead and the including overhead tick box. So the reason why this calculator, overhead and employment calculator, is also really important is because it does give us our overhead per hour figure. So in this case, it's $49.88. So I'm going to change this to $49.88 now and hit save. The reason that this is important is because in the employee cards, if we've got I don't know if any of these people will have a rate, but we'll go and have a look anyway. Perfect. So this is a great example. So Bob Smith, his overhead is $25 an hour. And if that's what the actual overhead is, that's okay. But if it's $25 here, but we're factoring in $49 in the labor rate, they're not aligned. We're quoting with this figure, our actual is this, and in this case, the overhead's actually less, so we're going to get more margin, which I guess is a good thing. But I like to have them aligned from the in the first place. So in here, I'm going to change this now to $49.88 and hit save. And I see this often. Members updating their employee cards for their actual costs, but they forget about this figure here. And the reason why this figure is so important is because if you have this including overhead tick box on the right-hand side for your labor rates, what it's actually doing is taking this top figure for the default overhead off your cost, and then whatever's left over is your labor cost for, say, when you're building a quote. So in this case, $49.88, but for my apprentice, we've got a cost of $50 an hour, but because my including overhead tick box is turned on, it's actually going to give me 12 cents left over, which I know apprentices don't get paid it much, but they definitely get paid more than 12 cents. So taking into account what this figure is and taking it off this figure, and then whatever's left over. And so that's why I guess adding those three figures together from our overhead calculator is so important. So generally what I do is add these three blue columns together, which luckily the calculator does it for us, in which case we've got our figures over on the right-hand side, and we can figure out an average if we need to. But taking this figure, total cost per hour, and putting that as my cost rate, as opposed to just considering their pay rate per hour, let's take into account the total operating expense as a business to have a technician on site for an hour. What's our true cost? And put that in our cost rate. And because at least then we've already factored in our overhead per hour in that figure. So when it's taking it off, well, we've already accounted for it. So that's okay. And whatever's left over should be an actual reflection of labor cost per hour. Does anyone have any questions about how that works, how the default overhead takes the figure off, so to speak. Okay, no worries, Di. So we do have this overhead figure here. Now, there are some members in Australia that choose to not run overheads through the system. So at the moment, everything is ticked here, including overhead, and we've got the figure at the top, and we've got the overhead figure in the employee cards. Now, if you want to run it that way, you can, if you want to achieve your net profit reporting. But some members in Australia just choose to do their net profit reporting in Xero solely. And so they just put the labor cost per hour and, sorry, I'm probably using some confusing terminology, the pay rate per hour and employment cost per hour in LaserPro, and they keep the overhead per hour out completely because they do that in Xero. So they don't want to run net profit reporting in LaserPro. They just want to achieve their gross profit reporting, which is possible. And I guess that's up to you as a business whether you want to do that or not. If that's something you want to consider, please chat to your VPM just so we can take all areas into account. And if you did want to do that, making sure that it's aligned between the employee cards and the labor rates. So it is just across the board factoring in, not factoring in overheads. The other thing that I have seen is for people set up customer specific rates. So in the labor rates, you can create a labor rate with a specific naming convention for a customer. And then say in their customer card, if I come back in here, come back into our rates tab and labor sub tab in the customer card. We can choose to have customer specific rates and then in their customer card, remove all the generic, let's call it, labor rates with the red toggle on the right. And then say we have their customer specific rates in the drop down, we can just add those specifically for this customer. So when we're building out a quote or a job for them, we don't have to see all the generic ones. We can just see the ones that are applicable. Now, the other thing that you could do is if you do have an agreed rate with a customer per se, but it's not say large enough to warrant creating additional labor rates, we can just override the sell rate at the customer level. So say for this customer, our general sell rate is 120, but we do a lot of work for this customer. They're a really good customer of ours and we want to sell it to them for 115. We can change it in this customer's specific customer card and labor rate and hit save. And that way, every time we create a quote or a job for this customer moving forward and use this labor rate, it is going to pick up this new sell rate for us. The other thing that you could do is while we have a system default, if you do want to override that system default at a customer level, because this specific customer needs a different default, you can do that. So if I tick advanced technician instead of just the labor one and hit save, we can do that as well. So as much as we have the system default and that's going to apply to all new customers created moving forward, we can update and I should say existing customers. But if we do want to override it at an individual customer level, we do have the power to. But it is quite handy being able to change sell rates for specific customers if we do have those kind of negotiations or contracts in place to give them a different rate. Is there any questions around the customer specific settings? Perfect. I will just, because we were just talking about customer specific rates, I will just touch on if I come back to my labor rates and system setup. If I open this up, this toggle update changes to all customers with the current rate. If you did end up going into a customer card and overriding the rates at the customer level, if you toggle this on, if you were making an update, that's not going to affect your customer specific rates in their cards if you toggle this on because they're at a different rate anyway. So it's only looking at whatever the current rate was before you changed it. So if it shouldn't affect it. The only time it would affect it is if you changed it from all customers with the current rate to all customers, because then it's not looking at rates at all. It's just going, I want to apply this change to every single customer card, in which case it could override and wipe their initial agreed rate that you've entered. So just something to keep in mind, because these two different drop-down options do have very different results. So just something to keep in mind if this is a scenario that you're using in your business. So that is the labour rates in a nutshell. Like I said at the beginning, as a trade business, you sell two things, materials and labour. So making sure that these figures are up to date as much as possible is really important. So for our Australian members, I'm not sure what your BPMs recommend timing-wise, but we recommend that members in Australia, look at that calculator every quarter, whether there's changes to it and whether the updates need to be made, but at least run the figures and have a look at it every quarter. And if there then is changes, it can be applied into LaserPro. If there aren't any changes, great, we don't need to update the labour rates, etc. in the system. But at least every quarter, run your eye over it just so you can make sure that we're running with the most current figures. Perfect. Well, thanks for your time this morning. The recording will be available shortly on the internet. And if you have any questions, please reach out to your BPM.